it's truly a pleasure for me to be here today talking to you about all the really cool work that's been going on blue waters in the fields of atmospheric science, climate, and weather. And kind of my own story, I joined this particular group at NCAR. I'd been at NCAR since 2009, and in 2013 I joined this particular group, and they've been computing on blue waters since it came online in collaboration with Don Wubbles at the University of Illinois. And I began giving the presentations at this particular meeting in 2016, and it was through coming to these meetings and through the allocation on blue waters that I got to know the majority of the people whose work I'm going to present today. And in fact, then came into collaboration with Ryan Shriver because I met his student here 2 years ago, and we've been collaborating on a PRAC for the past couple of years. So I want to point out that I think that what we get from blue waters isn't just getting our science done or jobs run on the machine, but it's really made connections and collaborations that I think are going to last far beyond the machine. Okay, so I wanted to start this talk off with some perspective. So throughout the whole talk, we're going to see some really amazing animations that result from incredibly complex models that are run on the blue water system. And I know that I'm supposed to talk about what's happened on blue waters in the past 5 years, but I'm showing this to give us perspective on really how great this resource is that we have, and how amazing our science is now, and how amazing our visualization capabilities are. So I'm going to go ahead and start this. This animation is the first animation that came out of the climate group at NCAR from the very first model that was produced in the climate group at NCAR. So this model was written by Warren Washington and Akira Kasahara in the early days of NCAR. It's just a 2-layer atmospheric model. What you're looking at here in the top panel, it's sea level pressure, and the bottom panel is the temperature of that lower layer. The animation just goes over 1 month, and starting from what we call a cold start, and then the system spins up. I just think this is really interesting. What will end up happening in this animation is that you will start to see storm systems in these mid-latitude regions that develop and propagate. So the concept of being able to get things like this in a model was proven with this. But this simulation, Warren tells the story that this was actually created on 35mm film. And if the beginning of it reminded you of like an old Western, or for me, like the old silent films, there could be a reason. It's because they actually had to take the film to a film studio in Colorado Springs. When they created the animation, they didn't have the ability to create color. And so this film studio actually had to film it twice with different filters in order to get the color. And the particular film studio they took it to was actually one of the early studios in creating Westerns. Okay, so I thought I'd start with just a little bit of background. Of course, my background is in climate models, but all the models I'll talk about today are represented in kind of grid format. And so what you're looking at here is the globe, and it's separated into what we call grid boxes by lines of latitude and lines of longitude. We also have grid boxes that go in the vertical, so they represent the vertical in the atmosphere. They also go into the ocean, so you would have grid boxes in layers in the ocean as well. There are equations that describe different processes that happen on the Earth, and those are solved at every grid box. And then, of course, grid boxes have to communicate with those that are next to it to pass the information back and forth. And in our climate model, we have actually standalone models for the ocean, the atmosphere, sea ice, land. Those are the 4 main components. And of course, those components have to talk to each other as well. I'm putting this up because I will be talking about a regional model. So this is what it might look like if you just wanted to run over a particular portion of the globe. So here we're looking at the contiguous United States. And then, of course, when I say increasing resolution, basically what I mean is you're adding more grid boxes if you increase the resolution. Oops, and I was going to do those, but I think for time I'm going to skip them. They were more about just giving you an idea. Again, it was focused on climate models, but how we would lay them out on big machines like blue waters, kind of more for the software engineers in the group. But I think I want to jump right into the science. And so I want to start this off by looking at the spatial scales and time scales that different Earth processes operate on. And so here you're looking at, on the y-axis is the time scale, and on the x-axis is the spatial scale. And then all of these ellipses kind of show where in that space the different processes might fall. And I don't want you to hold me to exactly where these are located. This is meant to kind of give you a rough estimate of the time scales and spatial scales that these processes operate on. Now, this particular graphic was originally produced by Dudley Chelton, who's an oceanographer, and so it only had these colored ellipses, and they were appropriate for the ocean. But I added these kind of grayish colored ellipses because I am going to be talking about a lot of processes that happen in the atmosphere, and so I sort of put up roughly where those would be located. And so here at the very large spatial scales and also time scales is where we find climate change. And then if we kind of move down here, here's where we would find the process El Nino. So this happens over in the region of the Pacific Basin and on time scales of interannual to decadal time scales. We have the seasonal cycle here, and then some of the things that I added, we moved down into individual storm events. And then down here we get into really small scale molecular processes. So anywhere you lie on this graph, pretty much you need high performance computing. You need machines like Blue Waters. And I'm going to show you, I'll put up kind of roughly where different resolutions of our climate model fall. And the way that this plot is helpful is that you can see the process that maybe you want to investigate, and then this gives you an idea of the type of resolution you might need to use and also the time sampling that you would need to do in order to capture that event. And at the same time, by putting up the boxes where our climate models fall, we can kind of tell what processes we're able to resolve with that particular resolution. So the red box here is what I call the fast but coarse model. So this is a model that might use like a 2-degree resolution. And when I say degree, I mean degrees in latitude and longitude. This particular model can get approximately maybe 30 to 50 model years per day. So that's the throughput that it gets. And what that means is in one calendar day, you can actually simulate 30 to 50 years in the model. So because it's so fast, we're able to run tens of thousands of years with this particular model setup. And then this black box is what we call our workhorse climate model. This is the 1-degree model. This model typically gets anywhere from 10 to 20 model years per day, and so we typically run it for decades to centuries. And then this blue box is what I call the slow and expensive. This is our high resolution model, typically with a 1/4 degree atmosphere and either a 1-degree ocean or a 10th degree ocean. And this particular model gets 1 to 2 model years per day. So very slow throughput, it's very expensive. We do see that as we go up in resolution, we're able to capture more processes, but it's also at the expense of being able to run longer times for these simulations. And so the main thing that cuts off how much time we can run a simulation is really the amount of allocation that we get on a machine, and then also just how slow the models start to run as you get into higher resolutions. So kind of like the others before me, I thought I would organize this talk, but I'm going to do opposite Brian. I'm going to start at the very large scales and work my way down. And also opposite to him, my expertise is going to diminish as we go through the talk. Okay, so this is an animation that came out of work from my group. This was from the 1/4 degree atmosphere model. And what you're looking at, basically it's moisture in the atmosphere. On the top panel is the present day, and in the bottom panel it's the future. Both of them are looping over just a typical year within those scenarios. And so the first thing that really jumps out at you is that the future has a lot more moisture in the atmosphere than the present day does. And this makes sense because with a warming world, warm air can hold more moisture. So that fits what we think might happen. But I also want you to take notice of smaller scale things that are happening. And so you can see these things that are kind of streaming out of the tropics and into the mid-latitudes. These are called atmospheric rivers. They're really important for moisture transport into the mid-latitudes. You can see that they seem to be kind of behaving similarly in both simulations. You'll also see at some point when we get into tropical cyclone season, you'll see some cyclones spin up and move through in both of these. And so, and if I were to show you also a similar animation but using surface temperature, the signal that would really stand out is that the future is a lot warmer than the present day, but you would also still see that there would be weather systems that kind of move across a continent. You would still have extreme heat, and you would have cold air outbreaks that are happening. And so one of the reasons that we run climate models for a really long time at high resolution, or we try to run them as long as we can at high resolution, is because we want to be able to resolve these smaller scale features that have high impacts, but within the context of what's happening with the global climate system. And so this was a study, again, that came out of my group looking at how tropical cyclones might change in the future. So what these plots are, each of these different boxes is a different simulation that we conducted. And the y-axis is the total storm count within each year of that simulation. And the blue and the green boxes are present day scenarios, and then the red and the purple boxes are future scenarios. And so if we just focus on the global picture, we see that we expect fewer total storms in the future than we do in the present day. So the number of total storms is going to go down by the end of this century. Moving on to just looking at storms that make it to hurricane status, we see the same signal. And then looking at storms that make it to major hurricane status, so category 3 to 5, we actually see the opposite signal. So we're anticipating more strong more strong hurricanes in the future than in the present day. And I also wanted to point out, I meant to at the beginning, on each of my slides I'm going to have a box, or maybe more than one box. And it may be that I'll put information that might be interesting to you in this box. So for example, the model we're running, maybe the resolution, just information that I gathered from the people who gave it to me that might be interesting to you, and I can't go over all of the information. One thing that if I had it, I put on here was the number of nodes that we were running on Blue Waters, in case anybody was interested in how big these jobs are. And then in the bottom right somewhere, I'll put the people who were actually involved in this project. Okay, so staying on the theme of tropical cyclones and also using the same model, the Community Earth System model, this is work that was led by Ryan Shriver at the University of Illinois, along with his student Hui Li, and they developed a tracking algorithm, and so for tropical cyclones, and what you're looking at here is the tracks of tropical cyclones from observations over 1981 to 2010. And the coloring is the intensity of the cyclone. So your category 4 and 5 storms are in the red colors. And then in the bottom panels, you're seeing model representation of those tropical cyclone tracks. On the left-hand side, it's using just the atmosphere. So in this case, there are conditions being read in on the surface, and so you're not getting feedback between what's happening on the surface with what's happening in the atmosphere. Whereas on the right-hand side, they're running a fully coupled system, and so what this means is that all the components, the atmosphere, land, ocean, sea ice, are all running, and they're able to take information from another component and then respond to it and then feed back onto the other components. So both of these models seem to do a good job of representing the number and the location of the tropical cyclones and the location of the stronger storms. But we can see that there is a difference between the fully coupled and the uncoupled simulations, and that the fully coupled seem to have fewer strong storms than the uncoupled simulations do. And I wanted to throw this up here kind of for fun. This actually comes out of work from NCAR again, and we have similar plots using a tracking software out of GFDL that we've made on various different simulations we have. And this is actually showing you what you get if you run the tracking software on the 1-degree model. So I really just wanted to put this up to show you that you really do need high resolution in order to capture tropical cyclones. Okay, so this is an animation out of Ryan's group, and it was done in collaboration, and I think I shouldn't have started it. Let's see if I can, here we go. In collaboration with the folks at NCSA. And this is actually one of, I think, the coolest animations I've seen for this type of work. So what they did is they ran the model with tropical cyclone forcing and without tropical cyclone forcing. And what you're looking at is the difference between those two sets of runs. So where the dots are on this animation are showing you where a tropical cyclone is, and so you'll see them moving around. And then the blue colors that you're seeing are it's the difference between those runs with the tropical cyclones and without. It's the sea surface temperature. And so you can see as like here, a tropical cyclone went by and it actually leaves behind a cold wake. And the reason for this is that as the cyclone moves over the ocean, it's mixing up the water column and it's bringing colder air up to the surface. And then if I move a little bit further along in this animation, it turns really cool. So now we're going to kind of go three-dimensional, and you're going to see what's happening in the subsurface of the ocean. And so this animation is really pointing out the connections you can have between these smaller scale weather-like features and larger scale ocean circulation, and also its relevance to climate. So as the tropical cyclone moves over the surface of the ocean, I already mentioned that it cools the surface, so that's the blue you're seeing, but these warmer colors are the subsurface, and so it's also mixing the heat from the surface down. And so when we're thinking about climate change and heating up the world, this could actually make a difference. And so it's really important. I think the cool thing about this work is that they're looking at the connection between tropical cyclones, heat storage in the ocean, and climate change. Okay, so we're staying on the theme of, in the context of climate change, what happens with extremes. And here we're looking at extreme temperature. The plots are actually showing you the difference between a future scenario and the present day in the number of days that you have in the year that exceed 95 degrees. So this is work that was led by Don Wubbles at the University of Illinois and his student Zach Zobel. On the left-hand side, this is results from what we call a moderate emissions scenario, or it would have moderate warming. And then on the right-hand side, this is a high emissions scenario or high warming scenario. And so what you're seeing here in the left-hand side, there could be, what this is indicating is that there are approximately 30-ish days in some regions of the country that will see additional 95-degree days over what we see in the present day. And on the right-hand side, that number goes up to like 50 or 60 additional days per year that will exceed 95 degrees. So one thing to point out here is that if we're able to follow this more moderate emission scenario as we move into the future, it can have a really big impact on the extreme temperatures that we'll experience. The other thing I want to point out here is that when we think about summer being June, July, August, and that's normally when we see our 95-degree days. And so when we're talking about adding 1 month or 2 months to that, what we think of as normal, as being summertime, is probably going to change in the future no matter which of these scenarios that we follow. And so this is really important work that's impactful for both energy resources and also agriculture. Okay, now we're moving into much smaller scale processes and moving into looking at clouds and storms. And this is work that was done by Sonia Lasher-Trapp at the University of Illinois and her students. So she's been looking at entrainment into clouds and storms. And entrainment is the introduction of dry air from outside the cloud inward. And this picture that you're seeing down here, this is a picture of a real cloud, and we've probably all seen this sort of cauliflower appearance to the clouds. And it's this process of entrainment of these internal eddies into the cloud that gives it that cauliflower appearance. And so one problem with models is that they typically tend to overpredict the amount of rainfall. And entrainment can actually kind of stunt the vertical growth of a cloud and therefore its development into a storm. And many studies have been looking at this problem in terms of how are the precipitation processes within the model represented, and can we do a better job of that, and is that why we overpredict the amount of rainfall? And what's unique about this study is that Sonia approached it by saying, what if it's entrainment that we're underpredicting? And if we're underpredicting entrainment, then we could be overpredicting the rainfall. And so another commonly stated, process is that we may have inadequate model resolution for properly representing these smaller eddies that contribute to entrainment. And so what she did She's using the CM1 model that comes out of NCAR, developed by George Bryan. She ran this model at smaller and smaller resolutions until she found the point at which she really didn't gain any more information about the entrainment. And so what you're looking at here is the liquid water in a cloud that was simulated by this model, running it at a 10-meter resolution. So this is really high resolution. And she actually found that once you get to 15 meters, you're not improving your representation of entrainment in the cloud. And so before this study, the impact of increasing resolution on entrainment was really only speculation. And the importance of this work is not to say you need to run your models at 15-meter resolution, but we can use what she's learned from these experiments and create parameterizations that might be used in coarser weather and climate forecasting models. So this next work comes from Lee Orff at the University of Wisconsin. And Lee also runs the CM1 model at very high resolution. And he looks at thunderstorms and, I always want to say volcanoes, I don't know why, tornadoes. You can see this isn't my expertise if I want to say the complete wrong word. And I think that Lee is really quite well known for these animations. And so he runs the simulations and also produces his animations on blue waters. And they're really quite spectacular animations. Lee's won awards for his work. He's been featured in Wired magazine and also interviewed on the PBS NewsHour. And what he did for me here was he put this animation together and then he also did a voiceover. So I'm just going to press play and let you enjoy this really cool animation of Lee's.
Has enabled our team to conduct breakthrough simulations and visualizations of nature's most
I didn't think about this part.
A comparison between visualized model output and actual storm footage.
Let me go back and thank you. I didn't think about this technical piece of it, so let me know if you can hear this.
Blue Waters has enabled our team to conduct breakthrough simulations and visualizations of nature's most powerful thunderstorms. A comparison between visualized model output and actual storm footage reveals uncanny similarities. Here we compare the explosive growth of towering cumulus clouds in our simulation to time-lapse video footage of a real storm. Supercells often contain pouch-like mammatus clouds that descend from the anvil of the storm.
Do you guys want me to start it over?
The storm on the left bears a striking resemblance to the field data shown on the right. The tail cloud of the supercell forms along its forward flank and delineates the boundary between the storm's cold pool and warm, moist air ahead of the storm. Our team has focused on this region because it is roughly co-located with a newly identified feature we call the streamwise vorticity current, a helically rotating stream of air that we think may be responsible for forming and maintaining the tornado that occurs in our simulations. Here we compare the cloud field of the tornado to video of a real storm. The simulated tornado undergoes morphological changes throughout its life that mirror what is often seen in nature. The simulated tornado begins as a narrow laminar vortex and over time widens and assumes a multiple vortex structure similar to what is often observed in the field. The sheer power of Blue Waters has allowed us to simulate storms where subtornadic vortices are resolved. We think that resolving these smaller, weaker vortices is essential in order to faithfully capture the processes responsible for the formation and the maintenance of the much larger, powerful EF5 strength tornado.
And then the last work that I want to highlight in this field is actually not using numerical models representing physical processes on the Earth, but it's actually taking data from a satellite called Terra and turning it into data that can be looked at to examine the processes that are happening on the Earth. And so in this particular project, it was led by Larry DiGirolamo at the University of Illinois. And they've been collecting this data from the Terra satellite, and we're looking at results from 2000 to 2015. And they created the color maps and also texture maps of the surface of the Earth. And so the thought process behind this is that with a changing climate, there might be processes happening at the surface of the Earth that you might be able to sort of visually see if you think of it in that way. So on the left, this color map, this is actually the color that your eyes would see if you were in space. That is, if you could average over time. So we have bluer areas over the oceans, and the wider regions are, of course, the cloud areas. And then the texture plots are sort of showing the spatial homogeneousness of the surface. And so these black areas are the area where we have low texture, and these are regions that are more spatially smooth. These are the desert regions and regions that have ice. And then the white areas are areas with higher texture, and we find these in regions like the subtropical highs over the different ocean basins, and also associated with high topography. This work was highlighted on the front page of the Geoscience and Remote Sensing Journal. And here you're looking again at these color maps, and these are trends of the color over this time period. And so I'm not going to zoom in, but just tell you in words that this project has found that over time the globe has been bluing. And although this project doesn't actually delve really into looking at the processes yet that might be causing these changes, it's more about providing this data for people to do that. But the changes that they have seen so far in both the texture and the color are consistent with a warming world. So things like the melting of ice, changes in the atmospheric circulations, you can see that in changes in the texture related to clouds. And then also they're seeing signals of man-made pollution, especially in developing countries like India. And so this is all consistent with the climate change that we've been talking about in some of these other projects. Okay, so this is just to point out that I think that the work that's been going on in these fields on blue waters is really cutting-edge research, and for many different reasons. They may be first-of-their-kind simulations in terms of resolution, or in terms of the number of simulations at that particular resolution that these projects were able to achieve, in the amount of data that's saved, in the frequency of sampling, and then also just in the mechanisms investigated or in the novel ways in which they were investigated. And this is my last slide, and showing you this picture. I actually took this picture. I happened to be working on this presentation on Memorial Day at the office, and as I mentioned, my expertise diminished throughout the talk, so I don't know very much about weather. So as I was going through this, I was learning quite a bit, and I happened to be going, on that particular day, I had gone through all of Lee's material and his animations, and when I walked out of my office, this is what was in the sky. And I was like, oh, mammatus clouds. So I thought, what an appropriate way to end my workday on that particular day, and I thought I would also end the talk with this. But I want to use this slide too to talk about the question of why blue waters. And so what I've done here is, in all of the information that people provided to me, I pulled out quotes, and this is to really show the importance of blue waters to their work and why blue waters was important to their work. And so I'll just go through these quickly. So one of the quotes, blue waters provided a massively parallel system, one of the largest storage and bandwidth computing facilities, and excellent sharing services. Whoops. Blue waters, with its huge number of nodes, its high speed, and its large storage capability for high resolution model output and analysis, allows us to push the spatial scale limit much farther than in the past. The hardware needed to run these kinds of simulations quickly exceeds the limit of most computers. Blue Water's staff have helped us to learn new and practical ways to visualize the output for easier analysis. The Blue Water staff understand the needs of our project and facilitate getting jobs through the queue. It's not just the machine that enables our science, but the staff as well. And then these last ones are some of my favorite. If we didn't have Blue Waters, we would have accomplished about 1/10 of what we did. These are the calculations I had been waiting to perform during my career, and Blue Waters presented that opportunity. And then lastly, machines like Blue Waters can create incredible simulations and amazing amounts of data that will long exceed the machine's lifespan. So with that, I'll take questions.
Are there any questions for Susan? Oh, okay.
So this is an astronomer's question. In your scale plot, length of time, why did you stop at 10,000 years? I think it'd be really interesting to go for 20,000, 100,000, millions of years to study the Milankovitch cycles.
Right, so I agree with you. Typically what's done, and one of the reasons is because of the time it would take to do those simulations and the amount of computing. So even using that fast model, you get 30 to 50 model years per day, but there's still a charge that goes with that, and allocations can limit how long you can run these simulations. Typically what's done, especially for paleo scenarios and things like that you're talking about and running back in deep time, is that we actually run the model for 1,000 years or something, but only for that time period. So we try to make changes to the model that would be consistent with what the Earth looked like. So maybe what the solar parameters were, where the continents were, that kind of thing, and run the model just under that. We don't have the ability right now to move continents around in a climate model, so you can't really truly do a simulation that would span all of that time.